Whoa, you guys really weren't kidding about wanting a deep dive with this one. This stack of articles about Syria is intense.
It's definitely a lot to unpack.
And the situation is changing so fast, it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around it.
Yeah, it's moving at lightning speed.
So we're talking regime change, geopolitical shockwaves, the whole 9 yards. Buckle up, everyone, because this one's going to be a wild ride.
Well, the first thing that really jumps out at you is just how quickly everything's unraveled. I mean, for decades, the Assad family grip on power seemed totally unbreakable.
Right, over 50 years. This dynasty has held on to Syria for over half a century.
And now it's all come crashing down practically overnight.
It's wild to think back to when Bashar al-Assad took over from his father in 2000. There was all this talk of reform and a new era for Syria.
The glimmer of hope.
Right.
And then, of course, 2011 happened.
The uprising.
Brutal crackdown.
And then we're in this horrific civil war that's just dragged on and on.
It's been devastating.
Absolutely devastating. But okay, let's get back to the present moment here. This lightning offensive by the rebels. I mean, this is unlike anything we've seen in this conflict before.
Completely unprecedented.
Aleppo fell with barely a fight.
And then Hama.
A major strategic hub.
Followed by Homs.
All within days. And then they're advancing on Damascus, cutting off Assad's stronghold from every direction. There are even reports of Syrian army officers being told the game is over.
Yeah, it's incredible.
So where were Assad's allies in all of this?
Right.
I mean, Russia and Iran have been propping him up for years.
Right, that's the big question.
We know that Russia's really tied up with the war in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And even Trump weighed in on this, saying that Russia's losses there have really weakened their ability to support Assad.
It makes you wonder what this means for the whole axis of resistance.
The network involving Assad, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen.
Right, all backed by Iran.
What happens to that network now?
That's a critical question, and I think we need to consider Iran's next move.
And what about Hezbollah?
Exactly.
Could this embolden other groups who are opposed to Iranian influence?
Possibly.
And of course, we can't forget about Turkey. They've been supporting certain rebel groups and pushing for Assad's removal for years.
Erdogan's been very vocal about it.
Especially with the millions of Syrian refugees Turkey's been hosting.
He's been calling for Assad's resignation for years.
So what's Turkey's stance now?
Well, their foreign minister has urged caution, emphasizing the need to prevent terrorist groups from exploiting this power vacuum.
Okay, so this brings us to the group that's now dominating the headlines. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS.
Right. They're the ones who spearheaded this final push against Assad, and they were the ones who declared his regime overthrown.
Their background is complicated.
To say the least.
They emerged from al-Qaeda, which has a lot of people worried.
Inside Syria and internationally.
They're trying to rebrand themselves as this more moderate force.
But it's hard to forget where they came from.
Right.
And so that raises the question, can they be trusted?
They did release prisoners from that infamous Sednaya prison.
That was definitely a strategic move.
A place known for the Assad regime's human rights abuses.
It plays into this narrative of liberation and reform.
But we needed to understand their true intentions.
What does their vision for Syria look like?
How will they treat minorities?
Women.
Those who oppose them.
These are the questions swirling around the world right now.
So what has the reaction from the international community been like?
Mixed. Mixed.
Some are celebrating the end of a brutal dictatorship. Others are worried about instability.
And the rise of extremist groups?
Exactly.
Germany's foreign minister spoke of relief for the Syrian people, while France condemned Assad's rule as barbaric.
But there's definitely this sense of uncertainty hanging in the air.
Yeah, like what comes next?
This is a pivotal moment for Syria.
No doubt.
And the choices made now will have huge consequences for the country.
For the region.
And even for global security. Okay, before we move on, I think we really need to talk about the human cost of all of this. Millions of people displaced.
Scattered across the globe.
The Syrian refugee crisis has been one of the biggest humanitarian challenges we've faced in recent years.
And it's only going to get more complicated now.
We had some data from the Netherlands that shows how many Syrian refugees have been seeking asylum there. And across Europe, it's been steadily increasing since 2010.
And then peaked during that huge influx in 2015.
But the response to Syrian refugees hasn't been the same as the response to Ukrainian refugees.
Absolutely not.
Now, some countries are trying to say that Syria is safe.
Yeah.
And they want to start deporting Syrian refugees.
Even with all this uncertainty.
It raises some serious ethical questions.
It makes you wonder if we've learned anything from the past.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and zoom in on Damascus itself. What's happening in the heart of all this?
Well, from what we're seeing, it's kind of a mix of jubilation and chaos.
Celebratory gunfire,
People flooding the streets.
presidential palaces being ransacked.
You name it.
There's this one detail that really stood out to me. That notebook they found in Assad's kitchen.
With his wife's culinary preferences.
Yeah, like her aversion to spinach.
It's this bizarrely humanizing glimpse into the life of this dictator.
Right. It's so
This man who for so long seemed utterly untouchable.
And now we're seeing these little personal details.
It makes the whole thing feel more real somehow.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's a reminder that even the most powerful figures are still just human beings.
But their stories are interwoven with these massive forces of history.
And those forces are definitely in a state of flux right now.
So where is Assad now?
Nobody knows for sure.
What happens next?
It's unclear.
And what about the potential for violence?
Very real.
There was that report of Syrian rebels clashing with U.S.-backed Kurdish forces.
It just shows how tangled and tense the situation is.
So much uncertainty, so many potential flashpoints. Where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, I think a good place to start is by examining the internal dynamics within Syria itself.
So we've got this power vacuum, right? And all these players involved. But let's zoom in on Syria itself for a minute. I mean, this isn't just Assad versus the rebels. It's way more complicated than that.
Way more.
So how do we even begin to untangle all of this?
Well, I think we have to start with HTS. They're the ones who are front and center now, and their history is rooted in extremism.
They came out at al-Qaeda, right?
Exactly. And that makes a lot of people nervous,
Understandably.
both inside Syria and internationally,
They're trying to say they've reformed,
that they're more moderate now.
but it's hard to forget where they came from.
It really is.
So what happens now?
That's the big question.
Will they try to impose strict Islamic law?
How will they treat minorities?
Can they even keep things stable?
Or will their victory just lead to more chaos and violence?
Especially with those reports of them clashing with U.S.-backed Kurdish forces.
Yeah, that's a worrying sign.
It seems like the fight against Assad might be over. But the battle for Syria's future is just getting started. And this is where understanding those internal dynamics becomes so crucial. There are all these other rebel groups,
Some with secular aims,
some backed by Turkey.
some who've been fighting Assad for over a decade.
How do they interact with HTS?
Do they cooperate?
Compete.
Ash.
All of that will have a huge impact on what happens next. And what about the Syrian people? After all they've been through, the war, the displacement, the oppression,
Right, what are they hoping for?
what are they afraid of?
That's a question we can only really start to answer by digging into these sources.
We see those scenes of celebration in Damascus,
People expressing relief.
hope that Assad is gone,
But there's definitely this undercurrent of fear, too,
the unknown.
especially with a group like HTS now in a position of power.
And what about the people who stayed loyal to Assad all this time?
What happens to them now?
Will there be retribution,
Reconciliation?
or will those divisions just get deeper?
It's hard to say.
It feels like we're at this crossroads, so many different paths Syria could take from here.
A peaceful transition.
Continued conflict.
The emergence of a new kind of authoritarianism.
Anything is possible at this point,
And the choices made by the key players will have a huge impact.
both within Syria.
And on the international stage.
So the role of the global community is crucial here. You said earlier that international reactions have been mixed.
Very mixed.
Some cautious optimism.
Some outright alarm.
So what are the main concerns for the world powers who are watching all of this unfold?
Well, the U.S. has already said they're going to keep their troops in eastern Syria, primarily to prevent ISIS from coming back.
Right, that's a big concern. This kind of instability could create the perfect conditions for extremist groups to regroup.
Absolutely.
And what about Russia? They've been Assad's biggest ally for years.
I mean, they poured a ton of resources into keeping him in power.
How are they reacting to all of this?
It's a blow to their influence in the region for sure. But as we said earlier, they're pretty preoccupied with Ukraine right now. And interestingly, one Russian official said that the Syrians now have to deal with their civil war themselves.
So they're basically washing their hands of this situation. What about the other regional powers? Turkey? Iran?
Oh, they're definitely watching this very closely.
Turkey has their own interests in Syria.
especially when it comes to the Kurds in the north.
Right.
And they've made it very clear that they won't tolerate anyone exploiting the situation.
Their support for certain rebel groups is going to be a big factor going forward.
That's for sure.
And then there's Iran.
Losing Assad is a major setback for them,
He was such a key ally for them.
both militarily and financially.
This really weakens their position in the region,
Disrupts their whole network of influence.
which stretches all the way from Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen,
It'll be interesting to see how they adapt to this.
and what they do to try and maintain their power. So we've got all these internal factions vying for control, an international community that's trying to figure out what to do, and a Syrian population that's just exhausted. They've been through so much.
It's a really volatile mix.
And as we try to make sense of all of this, we can't forget about the human cost. Millions of Syrians displaced,
Lives shattered by war.
hundreds of thousands killed,
Rebuilding Syria is going to be a massive undertaking.
both physically and socially. And this brings us to another really important aspect of this story. The Syrian refugees,
Millions of them.
living in limbo all over the world, uncertain about their future.
And with Assad gone, the question of repatriation becomes even more urgent.
Some countries are already saying it's time for the refugees to go back, that Syria is safe now.
Safe. But is it really?
That's a very good question.
I mean, is it actually safe for these people to return?
It's debatable.
The fall of Assad might signal the potential for change, but the situation on the ground is still really unstable.
Very risky.
There's still a power vacuum.
And the potential for violence between these armed groups is huge.
To just say that Syria is safe and ignore all of that, it seems incredibly naive.
It ignores the very real dangers that these refugees would face if they went back. So we have to think about the long-term implications of all of this. We have to make sure that the rights and well-being of these people are protected,
Absolutely.
and that any return is voluntary.
Based on informed consent.
Okay, so we've covered the internal dynamics, the international responses, the humanitarian side of things. But there's one big question looming over all of this. What does the future hold for Syria?
What are the possible scenarios?
That's the question everyone's asking.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so we've talked about the players, the power struggles, the international implications. But where does this all leave Syria? I mean, what are the possible futures we're looking at here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, it's impossible to say for sure. But what we can do is explore those potential scenarios, the things that might push Syria in one direction or another.
Okay, so let's play what if for a minute. What's the best case scenario right now?
In a perfect world, we'd see a peaceful transition, a new government that represents all Syrians.
A government that upholds human rights, respects the rule of law, and is committed to rebuilding the country after all this conflict.
Exactly. But that would require a lot of compromise from all sides. Everyone would have to lay down their arms.
And commit to dialogue and reconciliation,
It's a tall order.
especially with all the divisions and animosity that exist in Syria.
Decades of it.
So let's flip the script then. What's the worst case scenario? What do we need to be prepared for?
The biggest fear is that Syria just descends into more chaos.
More violence.
Assad's gone, but that doesn't mean the fighting is over.
Right, we've already seen those clashes between HTS and the Kurdish forces.
Exactly. And who knows what other rivalries and tensions might erupt.
As different groups try to grab power,
This kind of fragmentation would be a breeding ground for extremist groups.
like ISIS.
They thrive in chaos. They exploit the lack of governance to recruit and expand their influence.
And wouldn't that just drag in more international actors, each trying to protect their own interests,
Absolutely.
turning Syria into another proxy war?
Like we've seen in other parts of the region.
And then there's the humanitarian crisis,
War displacement.
more suffering.
Or lives lost.
It's a bleak picture.
It really is.
Okay, but let's say for a moment that a new government does emerge, one that's relatively stable, can maintain some kind of order, but what if it's not democratic? What if it doesn't embrace those values we talked about?
That's another very real possibility.
HTS is trying to rebrand themselves, but they still have those roots in extremist ideology.
It's hard to just erase that history.
So they might put on this moderate face for the world, but behind the scenes, they could be imposing a very strict interpretation of Islamic law,
Curtailing freedoms.
oppressing anyone who doesn't conform.
It could be a new form of authoritarianism,
Just with a different face.
using similar tactics to what we saw under Assad.
So the future of Syria really is hanging in the balance. Peaceful transition, chaotic fragmentation, a new form of authoritarian rule. Those seem to be the main possibilities right now,
And which path Syria takes will depend on a lot of different factors.
both internal and external.
The decisions of Syrian leaders
The actions of regional powers.
and the role of the international community.
It's a lot to process. We've gone from this seemingly unshakable regime to a sudden collapse, from a familiar dictator to a whole new set of unknowns,
It's history in the making.
and it's hard to predict what will happen next.
And that's one of the key takeaways from this deep dive, I think. We're seeing a major shift in the geopolitical landscape.
A seismic event with ripple effects that will be felt for years to come.
And as we continue to watch this unfold, we have to remember that this isn't just about politics.
Or alliances.
It's about real people
Syrian families whose lives have been torn apart by war.
who are just desperate for peace and a chance to rebuild their lives.
It's a good reminder that even amidst these global events, it's the human stories that really matter.
The individual lives impacted by the decisions of those in power.
This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. We've covered a lot.
Yeah.
But as always, there's so much more to explore.
And that's where you come in, our listeners. Stay engaged with these issues, seek out different perspectives, and don't forget about the human cost of conflict.
What do you think the future holds for Syria? What role should the world play? These are questions we're thinking about, because the story isn't over yet.
Keep an eye on the news, stay curious, and never stop questioning, because the world is a complex and constantly changing place, and understanding it is a journey we take together.